Naval Corvus. The Roman Republic was a land power forced into a maritime war. By 260 BC, the Carthaginians ruled the waves with generations of sailing expertise and purpose-built warships. Rome's newly constructed fleet was crewed by novices who stood no chance in a traditional naval battle of ramming and flanking. To level the playing field, Roman shipwrights designed the Corvus, a 36-foot wooden boarding ramp fitted with a massive iron spike at its tip. Mounted on a pivoting pillar on the ship's bow, it could be dropped onto an adjacent enemy vessel. The spike would punch through the timber deck, locking the two ships together. Suddenly, Carthaginian sailors expecting a naval maneuver found themselves fighting heavily armed Roman legionaries in close quarters. Rome effectively turned a sea battle into a land battle. At Mylae, the Carthaginian fleet confidently engaged the inexperienced Romans, only to have their first 30 ships, including the commander's vessel, pinned and captured. The Carthaginians lost 50 ships that day, and Rome celebrated its unprecedented naval triumph by displaying the bronze rams of captured ships on a speaker's platform in the capital. Caesar's Rhine Bridge. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar needed to project power across the Rhine, a massive and turbulent river that Germanic tribes believed protected them from Roman retaliation. Local allies offered a fleet of boats, but Caesar rejected the idea. Crossing by boat was slow, vulnerable, and failed to convey the absolute dominance he wanted to project. He decided to build a bridge, entirely from timber, in enemy territory. Roman engineers constructed floating platforms to drive thick wooden pilings directly into the riverbed. They drove these paired logs at an angle against the fierce current, which forced the structure to bind tighter together the harder the water pushed against it. Protective barriers were built upstream to catch logs or debris the enemy might float down to smash the supports. The entire 1,300-foot span was finished in just 10 days. Caesar marched his legions across, spent 2 weeks destroying Germanic settlements, and then marched back. To finalize the psychological impact, he ordered the bridge dismantled. He had proven that Rome could overcome Europe's most daunting natural borders at will. The Pilum, Roman infantry engagement, began before the lines ever clashed. Every legionary carried the Pilum, a specialized javelin designed not just to kill, but to disarm. The weapon featured a heavy wooden shaft and a long, narrow iron shank tipped with a barbed point. When the Romans threw their pila in a synchronized volley at about 50 feet, the heavy pyramidal heads pierced enemy shields with ease. The genius of the design lay in the unhardened iron shank. Upon impact, the iron bent under the weight of the wooden shaft. An enemy warrior struck in the shield could not easily pull the weapon out or hack it off, leaving him burdened with a dragging 6-foot pole. He was forced to discard his shield entirely, stepping into the path of Roman short swords with zero protection. At Pharsalus, Caesar recognized the weapon's versatility. He ordered his men to hold their pila and use them as thrusting spears against Pompey's charging cavalry. The horses and riders, expecting to break a standard infantry line, panicked at the sight of iron points thrust directly at their faces, breaking the charge and altering the outcome of the civil war. Testudo, approaching a fortified wall under a barrage of arrows and stones, was usually a suicide mission. The Romans solved this with the Testudo or tortoise formation. Upon the commander's order, a unit would instantly close ranks and lock their rectangular shields together. The men in the front row held their shields vertically. The ranks behind them hoisted theirs overhead, overlapping them like shingles on a roof, while the men on the sides faced outward. The unit transformed into a solid, windowless block of wood and iron that moved as a single entity. The interlocking shields were so structurally sound that they could deflect heavy debris, and it was said a chariot could be driven over the top of the formation. This maneuver was crucial in siege warfare, allowing engineers to safely reach the base of enemy walls to begin mining or operating battering rams. During Mark Antony's Parthian campaign, Roman soldiers utilized the Testudo to completely nullify the hit-and-run arrow barrages of Parthian horsemen, safely waiting out the storm of projectiles before standing up to resume the fight. Triple line. Following disastrous early defeats, the Roman Republic abandoned the rigid phalanx and developed the Acies Triplex, a flexible three-tiered battle formation designed to manage fatigue and maintain relentless pressure. The front line consisted of the Hastati, the youngest and most eager infantrymen. They absorbed the initial shock of combat. If they failed to break the enemy, they didn't flee. They executed a disciplined retreat through calculated gaps in the formation. The second line, the Principes, then advanced. These were men in their physical prime, heavily armored and completely fresh. The enemy, already exhausted from fighting the Hastati, suddenly found themselves facing a superior, rested force. If the situation grew dire, the Principes would also fall back, leaving the fight to the Triarii. These were the oldest, most battle-hardened veterans armed with long spears. They spent the early battle resting on one knee. To force Rome to use the Triarii meant the battle was at its absolute breaking point, but it also meant the exhausted enemy now had to fight Rome's deadliest killers. Most opposing armies broke long before they ever saw the third line. Wedge formation. When a Roman commander needed to shatter a densely packed enemy, he ordered the Cuneus. The Romans grouped their most heavily armored and experienced fighters at a sharp point, with the formation widening out into a triangle behind them. It operated on pure physics. The narrow point concentrated the forward momentum of hundreds of men onto a tiny section of the enemy line. As the tip forced its way in, the widening body of the wedge acted like a tool splitting timber, forcing the enemy formation apart and breaking their cohesion. Once the line was split, the Romans could attack the exposed flanks from the inside. At Watling Street, the Roman governor faced Boudicca's massive rebel army. Outnumbered heavily, the Romans anchored themselves in a narrow gorge. When the Britons charged into the confined space, the Romans drove forward in wedge formations. The crushing pressure of the wedges pinned the Britons so tightly against one another that they could not swing their longswords, allowing the Romans to systematically dismantle a force many times their size using short, brutal stabs. Siege warfare. If an enemy city refused to submit, the Roman army transitioned from a fighting force into an industrial construction crew. The goal was total isolation. The moment a siege began, engineers built a circumvallation, a continuous ring of walls, ditches, and watchtowers entirely enclosing the target city. At Alesia, Julius Caesar took this to an extreme. While trapping a Gallic army inside the settlement, he learned a massive relief force was on its way. His response was to build a second, outward-facing wall. His legions lived in the corridor between the two barriers, successfully starving the defenders inside while fighting off the attackers outside. Within a standard siege, the Romans maintained a relentless tempo. Catapults bombarded the masonry, sappers dug tunnels to collapse the foundations, and siege towers deployed battering rams against the gates. The defenders were granted no rest. But the ultimate weapon of the Roman siege was time. By cutting off all food and water, they forced conditions so desperate that defenders were often reduced to eating leather and the dead. The math was simple. A city cut off by Rome inevitably fell. Double envelopment. The Roman military perfected the art of surrounding an enemy by first being victimized by it. At Cannae, Hannibal executed a flawless double envelopment, bowing his center backward to draw the Roman legions into a trap. As the Romans pushed forward, the Carthaginian flanks closed in, and their cavalry sealed the rear. The Roman soldiers were packed so tightly they could not lift their arms to fight, leading to the slaughter of tens of thousands in hours. Rome studied this catastrophe intensely. The traditional checkerboard formation had failed because it lost its flexibility once compressed. At Zama, Scipio Africanus flipped the script on Hannibal. He arranged his infantry to leave open lanes, rendering Hannibal's charging war elephants useless as they ran through the gaps. Scipio then locked the Carthaginian infantry in a brutal frontal assault. Meanwhile, the Roman cavalry routed their counterparts and circled back, crashing into the rear of Hannibal's veterans. The Carthaginians were completely encircled with nowhere to retreat. Rome took the maneuver that had nearly destroyed their civilization and used it to finally crush Carthage.